On December 17, 2024, the unthinkable happened. Ukraine struck deep into Russia, not with a full-scale invasion, but with a precise and devastating blow. The target, one of Russia's most prominent generals, Igor Kirillov. But this wasn't just an assassination, this was a message. No one in Russia is safe. The strike shows just how far Ukraine is willing to go and how capable it is of reaching right into the heart of Russian power. It's not just generals feeling the heat. Russian President Vladimir Putin himself is likely losing sleep, wondering if he might be next. In this video, we'll break down the daring assassination of General Kirillov, how Ukraine managed to pull it off, and what this means for Putin's shaky grip on power. Let's dive in. Kirillov was accused by Ukrainian law enforcement of using banned chemical weapons inside Ukraine during the war, an act which constitutes a war crime under the Geneva Convention. Ostensibly, Kirillov was tried in absentia, meaning that he wasn't a part of the trial proceedings in the Ukrainian courts. However, the Ukrainian security service decided to go a step further than just trying to imprison him. Upon the sentencing, the Security Service of Ukraine, or SBU, decided that he was a legitimate military target that necessitated a targeted long-range strike. Since Moscow is extremely protected against drone strikes, as evidenced by Ukraine's previous attempts to launch them at the Russian capital, which were only barely successful, the plan needed to change. Thus, the SBU came up with another angle of attack. So a common scooter became the delivery mechanism for a small 300-gram or 0.7 pound explosive charge. The charge itself was supposedly a homemade device which took over 2 months to make, as all the parts had to be shipped directly to Moscow and separately. This helped the assassin prevent the Russian intelligence and secret services from learning about the assassination plot. According to reports from Russian media, the assassin is likely a man from Uzbekistan who was paid $100,000 by Ukrainian secret services to carry out the attack. While the actual identity of the perpetrator doesn't really matter, his connection to Ukraine does. As someone from a former Soviet country, specifically in Central Asia, the assassin would have likely had an easier time getting to or living inside Russia than a native Ukrainian. Ukraine's ability to reach people so deep inside Russian territory speaks to the extent of its surveillance capabilities and the actual scale of the problems that Russia faces. The actual attack itself was relatively mundane, all things considered. The explosive was rigged as an improvised explosive device, or IED, which used an electrical detonator that would start the explosion, which would cause the main body of the device to detonate. The detonator itself was connected to a trigger device, in this case a phone or a phone radio, which would supply the electrical signal to begin the process. The 0.7 pounds of TNT causes a high-pressure blast that can severely damage the surrounding buildings and kill people nearby. The mechanism by which the bomb was detonated is also relatively simple. A soldier, or in this case an assassin, calls the phone that is rigged to the device. When the phone starts ringing, the modified circuitry inside the phone sends an electrical pulse to the detonator, which then triggers the explosion. The logistics of using a scooter are somewhat novel in terms of delivering the device. The Ukrainians needed a mobile platform for the explosive device, and yet it needed to be one that wouldn't be noticed by any authorities. The scooter itself wasn't modified at all. The bomb was just strapped onto the scooter's handles, as if it were a shopping carrier, for example. With the handlebar being roughly torso level for an average human, the resulting blast would have the most devastating effects, further improving the odds of the attack being successful. The actual device is believed to be configured to deliver a directional blast outward in a specific direction, i.e. to the front of the scooter. This type of explosion contrasts traditional IED builds, which use a shrapnel bomb. In those cases, the metal casing is designed to collapse due to high pressure, dispersing high-velocity shrapnel in the vicinity, which is what causes actual deaths. The use of directional bombs means that the attack was meticulously planned from the start, with Ukraine being almost certain of the positioning of the device compared to its target. Then there's the fact a scooter is a relatively mundane item and one that was not commonly used to deliver explosive devices. These two factors allowed the assassin to just ride onto the scooter and deposit it exactly where it needed to be. After that, all it took was a single phone call at the right moment to perform the attack. Two vital factors make this attack somewhat different from previous ones, and we'll mention some other attacks later. First, the attack was conducted a mere 4 miles away from the Kremlin. Being practically in the middle of Russia's most populous and heavily surveilled city, the success of the attack indicated that the Russian intelligence services are likely subpar compared to the Ukrainian ones. It's possible that Russia is more concerned with trying to damage Ukraine as much as possible, rather than protecting some of its key officers, apart from the uppermost echelons of the country's leadership, of course. However, that doesn't quite explain how Ukraine was able to seemingly bypass this and strike inside Moscow. Secondly, the attack needed to be planned for months in advance, and yet the actual indication that General Kirillov would be sentenced came only in December. This meant that the Ukrainian secret services had likely already planned to conduct an assassination regardless, and the trial was simply a time-based constraint on when it would be delivered. With the sentencing, Ukraine essentially made the general a vital military target, which supposedly justified the attack, at least according to Ukrainian officials. Both of these are something that Putin is likely worried about. The fact that Ukraine can modify something as innocuous as a scooter goes to show just how potent modern assassination attempts have become. With practically nothing being safe from being turned into a weapon, Ukraine could feasibly try to assassinate Putin with all sorts of devices. That means that the Russian president would be hard-pressed to improve his security, as it's uncertain whether it would actually help the situation at all. This has led to Putin alienating himself from the rest of the country, both figuratively and literally. For example, he had ordered his longtime villa in Sochi to be demolished sometime in the first half of 2024. The villa was becoming a frequent target for drone attacks, as it's located along the Black Sea and relatively close to Ukraine. Satellite imagery in May showed that the entire villa was flattened, and there were no reports from the Ukrainian military that it was responsible for the event. Putin had previously visited the villa in March, despite the war practically raging in the region. It's apparent that he no longer feels comfortable going to the southern parts of Russia, as doing so would likely make him a sitting duck for the Ukrainian services. But even more importantly, Putin's everyday appearances have shown that he feels the danger all around him. As prime examples, take the fact that he frequently uses an oversized conference table for public meetings, putting as much distance as possible between himself and his guests. There's also the matter of him using body doubles for various public events. Japanese researchers have used AI-based facial recognition to detect whether Putin was present at public events throughout 2023. They have found that in most cases, Putin was actually a body double, with the actual Russian president likely nowhere near the publicly known location. The researchers posited that there were at least 2 distinct body doubles used in 2023, and there's a high likelihood that the Russian government is actively trying to get as many of them as possible on Putin's orders. The Russian president is too afraid to show his face to the public. At the same time, he's constantly spreading propaganda that the Russian special military operation in Ukraine is fully justified and even going in Russia's favor. And yet he also frequently fails to respond to obvious Ukrainian escalations during the war. A case in point was the Kursk invasion in August. The Kremlin severely lagged behind Western media when it came to covering the progress of the invasion. In fact, the first reports from the Russian Ministry of Defense were practically all false, implying that the Russian military had already repelled the invasion mere days after it started. Then the propaganda-driven narrative turned to villainizing the Ukrainian military for the invasion. This actually somewhat went in favor of Putin's domestic agenda, as the entire war was posited on denazifying Ukraine, and the invasion was the Kremlin's way of showing that Ukraine's current government is a threat to Russia's ongoing regime. Of course, the fact that the Ukrainian invasion of Kursk was a military effort to stave off Russia was conveniently skipped by the Russian authorities when spreading the message to their people. With the war going on for 3 years now, some people might think that most of Russia is actually against Putin. However, the extent of the Russian propaganda shouldn't be underestimated. According to Maria Snegovaya, an author and researcher for the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS Analytics Center, the Russian public support for the war in Ukraine has remained at a steady 60 to 70% throughout the 3-year campaign. Ostensibly, this is because of the lack of practical opposition in Russian politics. Over the past decade, there have been no real challenges to Putin's authority. The first Russian president, Boris Yeltsin, directly gave the helm of the Russian Federation to Putin. After that, Putin was replaced by Dmitry Medvedev, who was actually only a proxy for Putin because Russian law at the time prevented him from serving multiple terms. After the law was changed, at Putin's insistence, he's been the undisputed president for well over a decade now. Even the most recent elections in 2024 have shown that there's no real threat from a political standpoint for Putin's time as president. This is explained by the Russian mentality in a way. According to Brian Whitmore, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, the greatest threat to Russia is not politics or opposition, but chaos. Whitmore further suggests that Russians hate chaos. Therefore, any indirect threat to Russia from the outside is presented as chaotic, and attempts to remove it receive fervent support from the public. Naturally, one of the few ways Russia has to counter outside threats is through warfare, which is why the country has been in at least 5 conflicts that could be called wars in the past 25 years. Throughout all that, it could be said that the general Russian population is made up of 3 separate groups. The first is the hawks, who are supporters of wars based on the belief that Russia is superior to whatever opponent or threat it's encountering. Most of the hawks are men who come from smaller towns and villages throughout Russia, and who are commonly the most affected by Russia's aggressive campaigning for spreading its culture and influence to the entirety of the former Soviet Union. The hawks are estimated to represent roughly 30% of the population. The second and biggest group is arguably the conformists, people who don't have or want any meaningful ties and involvement in politics. For them, the current status quo is whatever Russia's domestic and foreign policies look like at the time. Based on the long-standing media propaganda that NATO is a threat to Russia, based on its aggressive posturing and continuous expansion to the east, these conformists have been found to believe that the war was inevitable in one form or another. The third, and perhaps the smallest one, are the opponents of the war effort, who make up between 20 and 30% of the total population. However, the actual demographics of this group are difficult to ascertain. For one, Russia has relentlessly persecuted people who have at any one point shown that they don't follow the government's propaganda. Secondly, a lot of people who were against the war were among the first ones to leave in the many immigration waves that started with the invasion in February 2022. By the end of 2022, roughly 1 million people left the country, most of whom are unlikely to return. These are the mostly white-collar workers with their families, led by men who left the country to avoid being drafted or persecuted for pro-European beliefs. As a result, the last group has thinned in recent years, which explains the seemingly endless support that Putin has enjoyed throughout the war. But arguably, it's not the general population that put Putin in power or kept him there. It's the elite who have allowed him to stay as president for as long as he did. However, Putin has done his best to dismantle the level of control the oligarchs have in the country. Initially, the ultra-wealthy could directly support the country during the early 2000s by privatizing companies that were previously public property. Many oligarchs started running companies that were practically vital for the Russian economy at large. But over the next 2 decades, this trend reversed. Putin's administration actively campaigned against privately owned companies being able to influence politics. He enforced that through either court proceedings, dissolving companies that didn't suit his narrative, or through more aggressive action. Russia is no stranger to rich men being found dead in their houses, cars, or vacation homes, with seemingly no good reason for their demise. Additional blows to the oligarchs came directly as a result of the war in Ukraine. Most of the ultra-wealthy only got to that status by using their connections and economic opportunities with Europe and the US. When the war started, Russia practically ended all major geopolitical and economic relations with NATO. This meant that the oil and gas trade, which practically flowed from Russia to the West, was significantly reduced. With that went the influence the oligarchs could even have in Russian politics. This only allowed Putin to accelerate his plans to dismantle them from vital positions in the government and politics. So what's the current status of Putin's reign in Russia? Without the need for oligarchs, the current administration is practically banking on the war in Ukraine. More accurately, the regime is being propped up by controlled spending on national defense and military. This is balanced by Russia conducting a significant portion of trade with China and India, specifically in oil and gas, as they became the biggest importers of these resources from Russia when the Western well dried up, so to speak. As a result, Putin needs support from China more than ever, and the only way he's going to keep receiving it is if he makes it seem like he can win the war. If he does, then the Ukrainian territory, rich in natural resources China needs and manpower that Russia wants, will be able to bounce the Russian economy and demographics back to pre-war levels. However, Russia doesn't seem to be able to do that, at least anytime soon. Somewhat paradoxically, Russia has failed to achieve meaningful goalposts throughout both 2023 and 2024. Only the last 2 months of 2024 saw Russia gain ground in Donbass, causing Ukraine and Western media to worry. Putin has repeatedly tried to use Russia's nuclear arsenal to bully NATO into delaying vital military equipment donations to Ukraine, with mixed results. While some donations were certainly delayed by a few months, Ukraine kept getting more and more equipment. Finally, when Ukraine invaded Kursk with practically no support from NATO, Putin's threats once again turned out to be empty. Over the next few months, the US gave even more military equipment, culminating in allowing Ukraine to use ATACMS missiles in Russian territory. Why does this matter? Again, for as long as Russia maintains the narrative that it's winning the war, it has support from both China and its general population. With oligarchs out of the picture, these two are the parties that Putin needs to woo, so to speak, to remain in power. And Ukraine has been running an aggressive propaganda campaign of its own. This typically revolved around debunking various Russian claims on the war progress or various policies that NATO and Ukraine have instituted over the years. But there's another, more important campaign that Ukraine has been a part of over the past 2 years, which brings us full circle to Putin's fear for his life. Assassinations. The attack on General Kirillov is only the latest in a series of assassinations that Ukraine has conducted. For example, the Ukrainian intelligence has recently claimed that it assassinated Dr. Mikhail Shatsky, who was responsible for Russia developing the next generation of cruise missiles. In 2022, Ukraine is believed to have been involved in the assassination of Ilya Kiva, an ardent Putin supporter who was a member of the Ukrainian parliament and fought for the country to surrender at the onset of the war. A Ukrainian-born blogger and pro-Putin military enthusiast Maxim Fomin, whose pen name was Vladlen Tokarsky, was killed in 2023, this time via an exploding bust. With these assassinations, it's evident that Ukraine wants to cut Russia's propaganda from the source, starting with the men who are most likely to disseminate news and contribute to the country's war efforts. Considering that the assassination of Kirillov was likely being planned months in advance, it's not out of the realm of possibility that Ukraine also has a plan to assassinate Putin himself, and probably more than one. And with Putin's current regime lacking any real backing for the administration that he built, there's a limited number of pieces that could fall before the public becomes aware of just how weak Putin's position is. After that, he could lose one of the biggest pillars that's keeping him in power. Worse yet, if some entrepreneurial Russians decide to join forces with Ukraine, they might become the people who kill Putin and inadvertently end the war. But what do you think? Is Putin next on Ukraine's hit list? Let us know in the comments below, and thank you for watching.